Welcome to the next installment in my series analyzing the stories of Fazbear Frights and assigning them as taking place in the game's continuity, directly based on a true story, or a complete fabrication by Fazbear Entertainment. This is the fourth video in this series, and although I won't be referencing theories from those videos quite as much as usual, there are some points/assumptions I make that are justified in those videos instead of here. Now that we have finished with the Stitchline, it's time to dive into Frights Fiction. But instead of me just describing stories and how they don't fit into the lore, this video will instead be focused on the stories that best tell us the in-universe timeline of Fazbear Entertainment, Fazbear Frights, and Five Nights at Freddy's, the in-universe game franchise. This episode features the following stories, as well as analysis of the Tales story Help Wanted and the virtual experience that's being playtested in the game of the same name. Let's start with the story I have teased throughout all of the earlier episodes, Out of Stock. It follows a poor kid named Oscar and his friends as they try to get their hands on Fazbear Entertainment's newest toy, the Plushtrap Chaser, which is experiencing Tickle Me Elmo levels of popularity and scarcity. They end up sort of stealing a returned model with human eyes and teeth. It chases them, following the rules of the minigame from FNAF 4 until they lead it to getting hit by a train. We later see the Stitch Wraith retrieving its scraps from that very train track. Eleanor's memories reveal that she had modified the toy, adding the dead human parts and presumably a speaker since it didn't have one in the advertisement. In my first video, I proposed that Out of Stock needs to take place close to when the man in room 1280 does, as it has Eleanor's agony in it. However, as At Wit's End pointed out to me in the comments of Yudi's video on the story, Eleanor's modification could have been muted enough to count. Fair point, that is what I claim happens with the Ella doll in 1:35 a.m. But as I explained in the first episode, there's more evidence that Out of Stock is the closest story in time to the man in room 1280. As I theorized, the man isn't William Afton, and everything is before FNAF 6. It references phone books, and Oscar is too poor to have a phone, but he is able to get $17.99 somehow. The only reason he leaves a third behind is that his friends are planning to share the returned toy. So Oscar not having a phone, even when it would be extremely useful with his family's lifestyle, is best explained by the story being set when cheap model and old mobile phones were less prolific. The best contrast is Oswald in Into the Pit, who has a phone so old he's embarrassed to bring it to class. And Into the Pit is so contemporary that the interactive novel updated a line to include a reference to TikTok. Well, at least in one version of the scene. If it was just Eleanor modifying the toy without the technology evidence, I would say that the chaser wasn't present in the distribution center and put it closer to the stingers, so we don't have to rely on the remains of the chaser being mostly undisturbed for something like 5 years. But as the evidence stands now, it makes the most sense for it to be older. When I say on the timeline, post-2007, but not by much, I mean an upper range of something like 2010 to 2012. It's hard to get a concrete date. You just have to rely on when it completely breaks suspension of disbelief for a 47-year-old to be asking for a phone book. Why Eleanor modified the toy should be obvious. It needed Remnant to power it, especially so that it would be stronger, faster, and more enduring than it should be. So she gave it some from a random person she killed. She was already connected to it, so she heightened its abilities and planted it as returned merchandise. And the speakers for psychological warfare. Classic Eleanor. While the story contains minor continuity errors within its own text, like Oscar being alternately 12 and a sophomore in high school, or how for spooky reasons the Imperium toy store is being kept around by a mysterious benefactor, but then goes out of business suddenly in the middle of the month, so it couldn't have been that it failed to pay rent. This is a plot thread that doesn't get followed up upon or make sense once Eleanor is revealed to be the mastermind. But I don't think this alone is sufficient evidence to say that it's an in-fiction story. FNAF proper has its own errors. Conviction happens after being charged, is it fall or summer, and a dropped plot line like the DCI. Its connection with the Stitchline and lore compliance in the plot means that it works better as
This one took place.
I will say that while the premises of the Fazbear Frights stories get increasingly wacky as you go through the series, the construction of the stories themselves gets stronger. I think this is the result of Scott and his ghostwriters getting more used to working together as time goes on. Like a TV show, the earliest stories have early installment weirdness. So how does the Plushtrap Chaser really exist? Well, this is before the publishing of the in-universe FNAF games. It's before the events of FNAF 3 in my timeline, and from Help Wanted, we know that the number of Five Nights at Freddy's games only goes up to the third game. This is consistent with the Help Wanted Tales story, where the dev completes 3 games and then is heavily suggested to die while working on FNAF 4. As someone who's still afraid of the nightmares, I can relate. How can there be a toy based on a minigame from a game that hasn't been published yet? The in-universe Fazbear Fright stories are related chronologically to the horror attraction of the same name. This is a time period when entertainment leaned more into making money off the rumors about their brand without putting too much effort into dispelling them. Frights is arguably darker than the games themselves. While they still want to trivialize real tragedies tied to their brand, it's not the making fun of it focused direction that the virtual experience was created for. If Out of Stock was in-universe fiction, the public wouldn't know about Plushtrap's minigame. Given FNAF 4 seems to have never released, it's likely that these concepts weren't seen until the virtual experience came out, remixing these concepts instead of the fateful VR recreation of the games that do exist. Oscar and his friends don't think of what they're a fan of as Five Nights at Freddy's. They think of Freddy Fazbear. They're not fans of a game franchise that has yet to exist. They're fans of watching videos about their real-life history on the internet, just like Timothy does in You're the Band. Instead, my theory is that the name Plushtrap comes from a nickname for a dangerous Fredbear-era Spring Bonnie toy, the very one this Chara-looking girl says her dad calls a finger trap. This toy had a reputation online for being creepy, off-model, and dangerous. When entertainment first starts wanting to make money off their reputation, they make a version of this Plushtrap with more play features designed for older kids. The company presents Plushtrap as its own character to distance it from Spring Bonnie, given the character's close association with the MCI. Why does it have the same mechanics as the Fun with Plushtrap minigame? Because it was based on Williams' designs for the Plushtrap we see in FNAF 4, however that works. As a reminder, you don't need to rely on didophobia to establish FNAF 4 as an experiment of some kind, as the core evidence for this idea comes from sister location. Combine these concepts and you have the Plushtrap Chaser. The in-universe origin of the name Springtrap, if it even exists, since I couldn't find any in-character references to the name, is reversed. The day shift staff of the horror attraction don't know there's a guy trapped in this suit. Instead they go, hey, there's a Springlock Bonnie animatronic that's so messed up looking, it looks more like Plushtrap. So we're going to call it Springtrap. How have Oswald and Greg not heard of Freddy's when the urban legend era has already begun? It just isn't something they're interested in. As ubiquitous as FNAF in the real world feels online, most people who aren't capital O online have never heard of it. And there are plenty of topics that feel like common knowledge in the online mystery community, which aren't to the general public. The release of the Plushtrap Chaser was a bumper year for the creepy Fazbear project. But in my timeline, Oswald, Sarah, and Greg were likely too young to have heard of it. You don't need an insane level of demand to create a Tickle Me Elmo situation as seen in this story. All you need is a lot of demand and insufficient supply. That's what happened IRL with Amiibos for a while. Corporate wasn't sure how successful playing into the rumors would be, so they didn't manufacture enough. If we assume that Fazbear has always been focused in the American Southwest-ish, this could have been a very regional craze, the result of location-specific TV ads. Oswald's ignorance could have been specifically the result of entertainment deciding to leave Hurricane alone. Someone actually personally affected by the MCI seeing their kid bring home a Frights book from the Scholastic Book Fair would have been too much controversy. But if Oswald liked true crime content, or even posted his psychically inspired Freddy's fan art online when someone could comment recognizing the characters, then he'd know about it. But at the same time entertainment was profiting from the rumors, in my timeline, they also launched a reboot Freddy's Fazbear's Pizza in Washington County, the one that we see in Step Closer. There's no problem with that. At this time, entertainment was playing both sides. They make money from people who aren't aware of their past, and from older kids who are fascinated by the topic. That's why Sarah has a normal Freddy Fazbear plush, which she would have gotten when she was even younger, in a story set after Out of Stock. This playing of both sides is even present in the Pizzaplex era. The design of the Pizzaplex in many of Tale's stories includes an urban legend roleplay auditorium, where older teens can do FNAF LARPing. The continuity of stories that feature this Pizzaplex design is questionable, since it doesn't line up with what we see in Security Breach. However, it would be understandable for the lore to ask us to see the Pizzaplex depicted in Security Breach to be extremely minimalist due to all the problems the real-life development faced, and we're supposed to imagine an even larger establishment, including every attraction mentioned in every form of media. Or this is just a different Pizzaplex. There's also the problem that the story the roleplay auditorium features and ends with the creation of a second good Springtrap. While there's nothing implausible about that story lore-wise, it's one hell of a loose thread. The point I'm really making here is that Scott has the idea that even the new version of Fazbear Entertainment isn't opposed to still making use of the rumors to sell horror content. While Fazbear likely never managed to create the same amount of hype, this would be when they started publishing Fright stories. There are likely far more of them than we have in the real world. It's a lot easier to find inspiration, and there wouldn't need to be a single author like Scott writing all the plot outlines. At the same time, they're selling a bunch of toys. That would be their main moneymaker. And when they feel they have enough interest, they make the horror attraction. Then the horror attraction burns down, and the executives in charge of it go, well, at least we can sell a story about it. What we found is a retelling of FNAF 3, but with a guy named Hudson as the night security guard. Springtrap is there, but instead of seeing phantoms, it's manifestations of Hudson's past trauma, ending in him burning down the attraction. However, there are some interesting differences between this story and the game. The main one is that Hudson has two security offices. The one for show that looks like the FNAF 3 office, and the one for doing his actual job. There's also a kitchen and a gift shop. I don't think this means anything. I'm only bringing this up to show what kind of details the based on true stories fright stories can change. And the biggest change is in character motivation. Hudson doesn't have any personal connection to Springtrap, and his stepfather is violently abusive in a way that isn't consistent with William's own flaws. It's complete disdain and disregard, instead of seeing him as his possession. Fire is in Hudson's past instead of his future, and it had nothing to do with Fazbear. Hudson is depicted as starting the fire and then perishing. Because of this, I don't think we can say for certain if Mike was hired using the name Hudson. I feel like the newspaper would mention if there was an assumed fatality, and using what Fazbear Legal would think was the night guard's actual name when he wasn't dead would open them up to too much risk for defamation because they would be accusing Mike of a crime. I think this time they changed the name, given the event was so recent, and unlike using the real names of the victims in other stories, it's accusing Hudson of a crime. Mike did, however, disappear after the events of FNAF 3, so they felt comfortable enough accusing a stand-in. A different name, the supernatural elements, and the fact it's presented as fiction would be enough defense, especially against someone like Mike. Hudson's grandmother says that heat purges, fire heals, which I believe is an extremely common piece of folklore and thus horror trope across the world in the FNAF universe. Humanity would have been dealing with stuff like haunted swords since we started killing each other with them, leading to stories of people reforging swords to escape vengeful ghosts and the like. It would contribute to the world's cultural perception of fire in myth and fiction. It doesn't indicate any kind of deeper knowledge on the in-universe author's part. I'm not going to analyze the story as closely as I have the Fright stories, but when it comes to talking about the in-universe FNAF fandom, this story is essential. It's a tale story about the rogue indie developer who made the Five Nights at Freddy's game, so the Fazbear Virtual Experience is supposed to parody. Steve Snodgrass is a stand-in for Scott, a guy working at a gas station who wants to be a game dev making family-friendly games, when he's approached by a representative of Fazbear Entertainment to make FNAF. He refuses at first, so they catfish and gaslight him, convincing him that years have passed and he has a family and kids, and the only reason he doesn't remember is because he has amnesia. They trap him in a house full of illusion discs, which he can hear, causing him to develop sleep disorders and paranoia. He rapidly produces the first three games, and while working on the fourth, he breaks the illusion discs and discovers that his family and house are all an illusion. The DJ on the radio, who is presumably his handler, tells him that everything he experienced may have been fake, but the happiness is real. All he needs to do is turn the disc back on, and they'll turn the nightmare aspect of the illusion off. He does so, and it's heavily implied that his wife then proceeds to stab him. This story was very much not what I was expecting. Before reading it, I had assumed that the crazed developer would develop an obsession with discovering the truth, diving into archives and forums to make his games as accurate as possible. Instead, any accuracy more than what would be in material provided to him by Fazbear would be from him being so out of his mind he's able to connect to the flip side and receive information psychically that he interprets as inspiration, just like how Oswald does when drawing Freddy's characters before he meets them. Another source of accuracy could potentially be that the AI in the VR game is closer to reality than what they're adapting in universe, because the pathfinding programs taken from the original animatronics are what introduced Glitchtrap into the system. The experiment on Steve had multiple purposes. Not only did they want to make it so he can easily be labeled as insane, I think they also wanted to test the use of crude illusion discs. Just like how in the trilogy, Afton Robotics made illusion discs that were subpar to Henry's, to use them in the Pizzaplex, which was beginning development, as well as the Mimic program. Not the Mimic, but it's implied that the animatronics of Security Breach are all based on their own versions of the program, which facilitates their human-like interaction. The first failed and the second succeeded. They probably killed him as he'd become a liability, although I do wonder what the pending lawsuits are about. Steve isn't around to sue them for defamation, and Fazbear can't sue him for defamation and/or copyright infringement. When it comes to analyzing the in-universe FNAF games, I think it's a good idea to take a look at the Assassin's Creed universe as an example. It does the same thing. Black Flag is basically Help Wanted, but with pirates, including the old antagonist existing as digital consciousness. But it's much clearer about it. While it does the same thing, with the evil corporation releasing games as propaganda, it operates on the principle of making it clear that they aren't one-to-one with the games in our universe. You can only be sure of something existing if it is present within a piece of media. The modern-day section of Black Flag is full of emails of your higher-ups debating about how they're going to warp the real history you're playing through to create an entertainment product that serves as propaganda for the Templars and appeals better to the lowest common denominator. Unity opens with the selection screen of various Helix VR games that are an uncanny representation of the real franchise. I think it's vital that we take this framework into analyzing FNAF. If we don't see something in Help Wanted or somewhere else in the Pizzaplex era, we can't guarantee that it exists in the in-universe version of these games. This means the in-universe version of these games don't have any of the 8-bit minigames and any of the Easter eggs that aren't present in the VR levels. This means that a lot of the lore is absent in-universe, which is exactly what the executives want. So, just as the story says, there are only 3 Five Nights at Freddy's games, and Steve had concepts for a 4th game when he died. That's where the levels in virtual experience go FNAF 1 to 3, then levels inspired by FNAF 4, but remixing them with different animatronics. Then the parts and services levels are just what minigame theming can you make with animatronics, and event repair is based on the love of giant vents in Freddy's and Circus Baby's rental. There were more rumors and urban legends related to Fazbear and animatronics in Utah than Steve was able to address before he was eliminated. There is another Fazbear-related game that is confirmed to exist, Freddy's Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. It is referenced in the story The Monty Within. Its continuity odds are pretty good. It features the Fazcade instead of the alternate Pizzaplex attractions that many of the earlier stories do. A guy gets glitch trapped by Monty, which isn't the most unreasonable thing, especially with the reading of all the glam rocks being their own mimic iterations. But the important part here is that it involves a Fazbear Entertainment fighting game attraction. Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator is the explanation for why Kane has any idea who Orville Elephant is. My reading of this is that in-universe, Pizzeria Sim as it was presented actually exists. It's a properly fleshed out tycoon game, no night shift surprise. And Fazbear's whole character roster is there, including obscure things they have the rights to, which is how characters in the Pizzaplex era are aware of characters like the mediocre Melodies. After a decade or two of just keeping their head above the water, publishing basically Goosebumps with one hand and a handful of struggling pizzerias remaining with the other, Fazbear Entertainment wants to go back into family entertainment. In The Storyteller, the current relatively hands-on chairman of the board of entertainment, Mr. Burroughs, has assumed the role relatively recently. Now, as a mimic-related story, it's either in continuity or it's going to be similar but with key differences, like the way Silver Eyes relates to the game. If this aspect, at least, is the same in both continuities, him assuming the role would be the cause of the change of direction. Fazbear Entertainment becoming an LLC doesn't mean it was resurrected from the dead. It's intellectual property purchased at a bankruptcy auction. A company can change its incorporation style without being completely liquidated. After FNAF 6, if Henry somehow managed to make Fazbear Entertainment completely insolvent like the trading tape says, it would be subject to bankruptcy proceedings. But since Henry is now dead and was probably acting very strangely before his death, his desire for the past to be the past wouldn't be respected. Instead of a liquidation, Chapter 7 bankruptcy, it experiences a reorganization, Chapter 11 bankruptcy, just like how it did at the end of FNAF 2. In a reorganization bankruptcy, the C-suite is replaced and plans are created to pay off their creditors. This would be when Mr. Burroughs assumed chairmanship. Fire may destroy remnant, but it doesn't destroy the relentless consuming drive of capitalism. Mr. Burroughs' change in direction wouldn't be immediate. Producing the games acted as an intermediate stage. They could make a bunch of money selling them and they become more popular than the books ever did, because people don't like reading. Then, after letting them become very popular, Fazbear Entertainment could claim that they were unauthorized and release their rebuttal, and in the meantime, they could sell stories about the game's troubled development. Yes, this is the Mpreg story. But before I go further, I'm going to have to defend this story, even though I don't really like it. I see some people being scandalized about this story, acting like it's a fetish story and in some way inappropriate for children. Just because it features a dude being magically pregnant with a monster doesn't mean it's a fetish story. The same way a picture of a woman in a bikini isn't inherently a sexy pinup. It depends on presentation and focus. This story was also published by Scholastic, not randomly uploaded onto the internet. Traditional kids' media institutions have guidelines about what's appropriate for kids, often evidence-based off of instructions from actual experts in developmental psychology. If anything, they usually err on the side of being overcautious. That's why ElsaGate didn't happen until YouTube content farms existed. It had to be made by a company that couldn't be dragged in front of a congressional hearing for corrupting the youth if enough parents got mad, like what once happened to video games and rap music. Just depicting a messed up supernatural version of pregnancy isn't inherently adult. Pregnancy is a valid topic for horror content, from the chestburster from Alien to Bloodchild by Octavia Butler. It is often used to explore concepts like reproductive violence, autonomy, and shining a light on the horrific aspects inherent to the biological process of pregnancy, which society usually tries to ignore. That said, as horror, this story wasn't very well executed. I have tocophobia, which is a fear of the concept of pregnancy. It used to be so bad I was in therapy about it. But I find watching the show Call the Midwife more disturbing than reading in the flesh, which is like if you wrote a story about a giant spider and an acrophobe didn't even blink. And it's not like Frights can't write good body horror. Room for One More and Pizza Kit are standout examples. Room for One More executes the idea of animatronic parasitism much better. Perhaps the protagonist is just over the line of being so full of himself it's no longer sympathetic. Another reason might be those very guardrails from Scholastic I mentioned. If this story didn't pull its punches when it came to executing its premise, it would become a story about sexual violence and forced pregnancy, which even though Frights doesn't have the goosebumps rule of not dealing with real world topics, that would have been a step too far. It would have made Springtrap Glitchtrap basically a rapist, which, like, I know he's already a child serial killer, but you can all feel in your gut that that would be too much for the funny, scary bear game. This is a recognized trope. Alright, now that I've got that digression out of the way, it's time to analyze the story like I normally do, although I'm guessing more non-readers than normal are aware of the plot this time. The story follows a game dev named Matt who has been hired to refine Springtrap's AI for a VR game called Springtrap's Revenge. It is explicitly identified as part of the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Matt is a real piece of work, a divorcee with borderline incel energy. To flex his power over Springtrap, he leaves an instance of the program running accelerated through the whole night. The fact that this would do anything is kind of ridiculous, but it does remind me of how a lot of generative AI models will start to lose coherence the longer a session goes on, if they're programmed to remember their previous responses. Duck's Pajama Sam playthrough is a good example of this, which does connect it to Glitchtrap in another way by way of the Mimic, as the Mimic is a machine learning model. Overnight, Springtrap kept generating new versions of himself, and each new one killed the old one. Matt came back to work and found that Springtrap spread his code across all of the game files, so Matt can't delete it. Which, skill issue on the dev's part for not having a backup. Matt confronts Springtrap inside the game and experiences an electric shock when he encounters it. Over the next several days, Matt experiences various pregnancy symptoms, eventually culminating in him cutting open his stomach. Then a more organic born-sized Springtrap pulls itself out of the cut and calls Matt Daddy. Good news, everyone!
Never happened.
I spent a while mentally debating if Glitchtrap could cause hysterical pregnancy. Oh, but other people see that he has physically grown at a rate that can't be explained by metabolic changes. Maybe it's all in Matt's head, but a cop sees a piece of fur left behind by Fetus Trap when he investigates Matt's apparent suicide. Then I realized, Springtrap's Revenge is a pure horror game. There's no escaping from Springtrap in a maze level and help wanted, so this game couldn't have been made in the game's verse. I know I labeled this as completely made up, but it would have been published to make light of the delays the virtual experience was dealing with as a result of Glitchtrap. Perhaps information about Jeremy cutting his face off and the mysterious presence of a yellow rabbit leaked to the public. Both Springtrap in this story and Glitchtrap have the motivation of taking over someone else's body to give themselves a physical form, as Fetus Trap is presented more as Springtrap Reborn than as his child. Prankster is the other story that deals with the development of a FNAF VR game. It is set in a struggling game studio with only 3 employees, Jeremiah, Parker, and Hope. Jeremiah is the protagonist and has a crush on Hope, who is in a support staff role. Parker, the other dev, is a jerk who likes pranking Jeremiah. Their studio has been bought out by Fazbear Entertainment to make a VR game, for which no details are given. When Jeremiah hears Hope and Parker seemingly making out in the testing room, he goes home early. The next day, on his birthday, when Jeremiah comes in, a Saw-style voice message says that they've taken Hope and Parker, and that Jeremiah needs to solve puzzles to find them. The clues he finds include pieces of Hope and Parker's bodies. Unlike in the flesh, it is actually good horror. He eventually finds a VCR recording of Hope and Parker gleefully setting up the clues themselves. It ends with an unknown person entering the supply closet, presumably murdering Jeremiah. As expected with a VR game, smartphones are plentiful. Jeremiah remembers going to Freddy's when he was a kid and remembers a CRT television and a VCR from his grandmother's house. But the actually important timeline stuff is the development of Freddy Fazbear's virtual experience. Making the game was contracted to Silver Parasol Games before Vanessa, the player in Help Wanted, does in-house quality assurance, as the opening narration of the game indicates. In the special delivery emails, their contract is suspended after Glitchtrap installs himself in Vanessa. I'm not sure if these dates listed on the wiki transcripts of the released emails are in universe. They're not present in the unreleased emails or any other transcripts I've found, so they might be the IRL release dates of the emails in the app. 2019 also feels kind of early for Help Wanted to be set. Regardless, I still feel like it's a good assumption that the canceling of the contract to make the virtual experience and Vanessa's weird behavior is concurrent. But Fazbear Entertainment isn't going to let a little thing like a body count stop them from releasing the virtual experience. They bought out the almost failed game studio to finish up the game, implementing Vanessa's QA notes from before she had bigger concerns. Full buyout instead of a contract would give the higher-ups more control. 2 devs isn't enough to make the virtual experience themselves, but it is enough to finish it. It actually being published is what makes the most sense, as it provides an explanation for characters referenced as merch in the Pizzaplex who would only be in a Fazbear product through virtual experience. And like I said earlier, a body count isn't going to stop entertainment from going through their rebranding efforts. But Glitchtrap was still in the system. Satisfied that it already had Vanessa for a physical body, it decides to have some fun once it was in Hope and Parker's heads, mimicking Parker's pranks as well as horror tropes in general. This is what the Ultimate Guide says happens. The story is simultaneously very well executed, but it also feels more like a generic horror movie than FNAF. So, Glitchtrap might have been inspired by the results of the Google searches making as Vanessa. Later, Vanessa came in and got enough of Glitchtrap out of the game that it could ship without instantly causing a mass casualty event. Frankly, this is one of the stories where the assuming continuity unless for reason to believe otherwise mindset is the strongest. This could very well be another story making fun of the delays virtual experience had, and possessing Vanessa removed Glitchtrap enough for the game to ship as is, no need for a second studio. The cutting off of body parts could be based on what Jeremy did. The use of different names is the result of it being a more recent event without public news coverage. Here's the timeline for the in-universe FNAF fandom this video proposes. It's hard to say when most of the stories I consider to be Frights Fiction were published, other than the range I give for the series as a whole. Next up is Into the Pit, where we will be analyzing the short story game and interactive novel versions, hence it gets its own episode. All of my confusion about the ball pit has been resolved, replaced with the same kind of just enough supported craziness I had in the first episode of the series, and I can't wait to lay it out. Absol out.